Meanwhile, as 2002 rolled on, there's been bombing. The Bush White House, with George W. Bush, right, the son of George Herbert Walker Bush, who went to war in Iraq, is in charge, and he desires to replace Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Well, why? Well, he wants, actually it's his cabinet. He doesn't really know he doesn't really know what he's doing. I'm not convinced that Bush knew what he was doing. I think he was controlled by, well, I don't think he was but he was convinced by Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, Condoleezza Rice, Donald Rumsfeld, and a whole bunch of the people who came to be called the Vulcans. Basically what to do, and he was given. They were the theorists, and he was basically sort of the popular face of this particular group of politicians. I don't include Colin Powell in that because I think Colin Powell was a sucker. Basically, I think that another discussion. That's another discussion. I don't trust Colin Powell. Let me put it that way. So, and I don't think he's a great man. But they're looking at Iraq and they're like, we would like to have somebody who we could control. We'd like that. Who could be counted on to create a stable U.S. footprint in the Middle East. We'd really like that. I mean, they really like to be able to build some nice, big military bases and leave people in Iraq with no fuss, no muss. Like we're just going to stay there. They want to be able to guarantee Israel's security. As I said, either yesterday or a couple days ago or whenever it was, always a major issue that could protect U.S. oil interests and, very importantly, could be closer to Iran in case of a war. Right? So these are some of the reasons why you would look at Saddam Hussein and say, he could go. We need somebody we can control who would make a deal with us and say, oh yeah, we welcome our U.S. Friends and so on. It's unlikely, and they began talking about what they called regime change. Very few euphemisms in the last 20 years have been as destructive as that particular one. Regime change came to mean basically, we'll put in who we want. We've seen this before. We saw it in Vietnam. When Kennedy has Diem assassinated in 1963 in Vietnam, that's a regime change, effectively. It's not quite as dramatic as knocking over a whole country, but it's pretty dramatic. And so this concept of regime change, which is invasion, starts with invasion, and then an occupation, and then a wholesale replacement of the government by a sovereign country, right? So that you come in and you put in the people you want. This came to be what W, as he was called, D-U-B-Y-A, W, because of the W in the middle of his name, essentially stood for. As I say, really, the people who were behind him were running the show. And effectively, as far as I was concerned, he was a puppet. If you're interested in this, have a look at a book by James, cannot remember his last name, called The Rise of the Vulcans. It's a great little book, not so little, and it's beautifully written. I can't remember the guy's name. I'll put it up. And these are the people who are known as neocons. So the word neoliberal, the phrase neoliberal, comes out of this use of neocons, because the neoconservatives, this is the people who basically we identify as neocons. So all the people I just talked about, I'll put up a slide of them. Who have I got? Who do I have for the? I chose 5 key players here, which I'll put up. These are some of the Vulcans. One of them, the first one, Paul Bremer, is not as much of a theorist as the other people are. But basically, these are the people who write the script, which everybody else will follow for the next, basically, the 2 terms of the Bush presidency, the second Bush presidency. And this neocon cabinet includes the people who are truly responsible for the war in Iraq. And they are, I put them up here. I know it looks alphabetical. Well, it is alphabetical. They're not necessarily in order of power. Like Dick Cheney is probably one of the most terrifying and one of the most powerful. Condoleezza Rice, extremely dangerous. Donald Rumsfeld, dangerous and crazy. Paul Wolfowitz, very dangerous. Yeah, I mean these are all people who, now basically they come from. They are trained in politics by a famous political scientist named Leo Strauss, and Strauss had this particular idea of how you would run foreign policy. So when his group of people, I mean, he trains this whole group, and when they get into power, they're like, we're going to do Strauss's foreign policy. And that's what they do, which means that they open a second war. So here's the United States, Canada, Britain, France, busy bombing Afghanistan and saying we're at war in Afghanistan. And then here comes the neocons who call themselves the Vulcans, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And they open a second war, a second front in Iraq. And the concept of to explain how incredibly dangerous this is, you have to in some ways go back to World War II and think about the fact that it took the Allies years to decide to open a second front in World War II, because they were already fighting in Europe, and they had to decide, okay, if we're really going to win this, we also have to fight in Italy, so in Southern Europe, you know. So, and the Americans were busy fighting in the Pacific with the Japanese. So they were stretched, and they could see that they were going to be stretched terribly thin. So it was very, very dangerous. So you can see how much the Americans were just, this particular group of Americans was like, there's nothing we can't do. We'll just go and do it. We're just going to spend all this money, and we're going to do it. The group, as I say, referred to itself as the Vulcans. Vulcan is the Roman god of the forge. The Greek equivalent is Hephaestus, and Hephaestus is a smith, a famous smith. There's a whole section given to him in the Iliad because he makes Achilles' shield, and it's this amazing work of art, and it has on it the whole narrative, basically, of the war. Anyway, so it's interesting that these people align themselves not with the Greeks, who we think of as being the authors of the Enlightenment and so on, but with the Romans, because the Romans are imperialists, right? And the Greeks are statesmen, statespeople. Well, they were statesmen because there really weren't any female rulers. So the Greeks, basically, I remember reading a thing at the time which said that Americans would like to think they're Greeks, but are actually Romans. And because the Greeks basically brought, they were bad news in terms of, going to war and doing all typical things that empires do. But at the same time, the idea was that they brought ideas, right? Whereas the Romans were just like force. We're going to build an empire, and we're going to extend the empire, and everybody's going to be Roman, and okay. So that should sound familiar, right? And these particular Vulcans, as they call themselves, were mostly devoutly Christian. Some were Jews. Feith, Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, all Jews. And why is that important? It's important because it's going to frame their foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel, that they are going to push for bases in Iraq so they can support Israel. So there's going to be a direct one-to-one. It's like, we do this, protects Israel, okay, that's why that's an issue. And Bush initially framed the war with Iraq and Iran as a holy war and as a crusade. And they had to walk that back really fast. He called the initial operation Operation Infinite Justice. And and within a couple of days, people were like, "Ooh," like they were like, "Oh, okay, we're not calling it infinite. It's infinite freedom," because infinite justice sounds so much like the Old Testament, and it is like the Old Testament. It's basically an eye for an eye. It's Old Testament justice. Well, wait, if you're Christian evangelicals, you don't believe in Old Testament justice anymore. That's the point of being a Christian. Jeez. Literally, jeez. In other words, these people were the gods of shaping. That's what Vulcan is. He's a god of making in the forge, right? It's a very violent image. And we still talk about vulcanizing rubber. So each one of these people that I've mentioned is going to hold key positions of power during Bush's 2 administrations. So they will stay in power. They will not be knocked out of power. They will not be rotated out. Unlike the Trump White House, where sort of people are in for like 3 weeks and then they're out because they get too much press or somebody likes them too much or whatever. Or they take the sunlight away from Donnie. It's like no. This is not the same thing at all. This is a very stable group. They know what they want and they're going to pursue these. So what we have is the United States fighting 2 separate wars. One in Afghanistan, then there's Iran, right? So this is Afghanistan over here, then Iran, then Iraq. 2 separate wars, right? A 2-front war. And both are occupations with varying levels of support for the missions from outside. Much more support for Afghanistan because people feel, the United States was hurt and we stand with the United States. And with Iraq, it's like, well, wait a minute. I mean, what did they do to you recently? Because Iraq hadn't really done anything recently. So you sort of need to have, you need to get into your head that there are these 2 President Bushes. The first one is President 43. Then there's Clinton. And then there's Bush the second, President 45. I'll usually call him Bush the second, just to be clear. Okay. All right. So here are the dates for those wars at the moment, as well as their U.S. and coalition involvement, because there's supposed to be a coalition fighting in both cases. Much more with Afghanistan, less with Iraq. Right? In Afghanistan, between 2001 to 2011, so for 10 years, the troops are there. Canadian troops have been there until very recently. They were still present. Canadian troops, I don't remember I haven't looked to see whether we have anybody left in Afghanistan. I think we do. I think we have small teams because I remember a couple of years ago there was one of these snipers took one of these incredible shots that was over a mile long and killed his objective and so on. But are there still Americans in Afghanistan? As far as we know, there are, even though Trump has said that he has stopped the war in Afghanistan and has withdrawn all the troops. That just happened in 2019. Yeah, in 2019. Well, no, we're in 2020. Yeah, it just happened in 2020. And the sequel of that is an interesting one, which I'll tell you in a minute. In Iraq, between 2003, the fighting started in 2003, the war started in 2003, between 2003 and 2011. By 2011, the war was declared officially over. There were still U.S. troops on the ground and advising and fighting at this point. Again, it's hard to know exactly what's going on now. As of 2015, there were still troops. Many fewer than there had been during the 8 years of the war. Why these are called the long wars is that basically they have gone on and are still going on now. It's now 2020, so 19 years for Afghanistan, 17 years for Iraq. Okay. How is the United States not still at war in both these countries? I haven't seen anything to prove that they're not. I understand that can be taken as an appeal to ignorance. That because I haven't seen it's not, it is. As I say, Trump came in with his own little fix for this because fundamentally he's an isolationist. Okay. Was the war in Afghanistan about 9/11? No. It was a geopolitical position resource war. basically, the idea still was, if the idea was to capture and kill Osama bin Laden, you don't go to war for that. In fact, you don't indicate you're going to do that stuff at all, because people are just going to run if they know that you're on the way. If you want to get this particular group, you go hunting with small teams, and you don't bomb a country for 3 months and then roll in troops and expect you're going to find your targets, especially if they're known to be guerrilla fighters, which they are experienced guerrilla fighters too by this time. The sequel, that is the sequelae to all of this, is that in the last few months, Trump has withdrawn, he says he has withdrawn, and we don't really know, has withdrawn the final troops from Afghanistan and has begun to negotiate peace accords with the Taliban. So ironically, who's in charge at the end of basically an accumulated sort of nearly 40 years of war? The Taliban.